Welcome to the Virtual Memories Show. I'm your host, Gil Roth, and we're here to preserve and promote culture, one weekly conversation at a time. You can subscribe to the Virtual Memories Show through iTunes, Spotify, YouTube, Google Play, and a whole bunch of other venues. Just visit our sites, chimeraobscura.com/VM or vmspod.com to find more information, along with our RSS feed. And follow the show on Twitter and Instagram at VMSPod. Well, I'm recording this from a hotel room in San Diego. It's the last day of my business trip. I spent the weekend in Santa Monica, then I came down here for a couple of days for a biotech conference, and I'll be on a red-eye flight back to New Jersey tonight, and maybe going straight from that into a client visit near the airport, which ought to be entertaining, even if I don't remember any of it. It's been a good trip, though. I got to record a follow-up podcast with Howard Chaykin, which will air soon. And I caught up with some friends/past pod guests, Michael Gerber, Kate Maruyama, and Maria Alexander. And it was good. It's always weird for me to talk off mic with people, especially people I've recorded with, because I get this nagging sense of how I could get an episode out of this, and I'm wasting it, I guess. But I was glad to just talk like a human being for a little bit. At least I think I fooled them. And last night I had dinner with one of my pals who I met through my pharma work, and we've become good friends. He's a guy I recorded with 10 plus years ago, John Bertagnoli. You have to go way back in the archives for this one. We did a short episode when I was just starting out. It was just a few weeks after John had suffered this near-death experience, or a full-death experience from which he was revived. Anyway, that was all 10 years ago, and John loves this show, and we had a really good time last night just gabbing at dinner after the conference. We talked pod stuff and his family and some of my crazy, wacky stories and things I don't talk about on the air, so sorry. But anyway, the whole trip has been good, but it has meant that I've gotten on a plane for the first time in 28 months. And that wasn't as mentally weird as I feared it would be. Didn't have any psychological hang-up. There was just the general anxiety of planning before a trip, which I've always had, and was glad to see that came back. But the weird thing was, just after takeoff, when it occurred to me that it's a really unnatural event, flying, but it really felt just natural, felt routine, just like roaring into the sky and pivoting in the air over the industrial landscape around Newark, and just having this moment where I realized I was getting a perspective. I was looking at the planet and the land below me in a way that no one in history from, more than like 100 years or so ago could ever have seen. This is dumb shit that I think about, in idle moments like that, but it was just so routine and so novel simultaneously. I was glad to make the trip. I was glad to get back into flying again. I stayed masked up the entire time except while I was eating. Tested negative a day later because you have to test to go into this conference. But anyway, I got to catch up on some episodes of Better Call Saul too, so that was good. But now I've got to go get ready for day 2 of the conference, so let's get to the show. Now, my guest this week is Alexandra Lang, who has a new book out today, which is June 14th, 2022, for you time travelers out there. Her book is Meet Me at the Fountain, An Inside History of the Mall from Bloomsbury, USA. Alexandra has written a wonderful history of a pretty unappreciated/underappreciated piece of the American landscape, the mall. And by landscape, I don't just mean like the physical or geographical, but the mental landscape too, what it means to us. And she, throughout the book, explores the history from the first shopping centers into mega malls, into some of the weird variations malls have taken in recent years, and sort of, what that evolution's been like for a place or a thing where so many of us spent so much time in our lives. And she does a really masterful job of blending the architecture and the economics and the social forces and the racism and the design and so much more to sort of evoke an understanding of where malls came from and how they grow and die and what potential they have today and what they reflect and have reflected throughout their history of American life from the post-war era onward. When I mention racism, that's a big redlining and the growth of suburbanization and the growth of the car, all those things combine to make the shopping center and then the mall a possibility. And she really, like I say, masterfully goes into that history and conveys it in ways that are really, well, I'll just say, understandable to a lay reader. She doesn't go into jargon or theory or anything. This is really meant for a popular audience. And gosh, the writing is so good, and she goes into so many great threads of this stuff. I was very impressed and very happy by Meet Me at the Fountain. So I love this book. And even though I've been a mall habitué for most of my days, the last bunch of years notwithstanding, it really helped me see that environment, again, both the mental and the physical, in a much more profound way. And it also, of course, filled me with nostalgia for the days when just hanging out in the arcade or a mall bookstore was enough. But one of the best aspects of the book is just the way Alexandra conveys that sense of change for the mall concept, for us, for how we spend our time in the internet era and what it meant to go to the mall once upon a time. So go read Meet Me at the Fountain and maybe think back on all that time we whiled away at the mall. Now, there are a couple of minor caveats. There's some construction noise and, of course, cops on Alexandra's end because she's in Brooklyn. And when I ask whether malls are feasible in an urban setting, what I'm really asking is, are malls feasible in New York? Also, we recorded this the morning before my trip, and I was, as I mentioned, kind of mentally frazzled by prepping for that. So I'm a little bouncier than usual in this one. Anyway, here's Alexandra's bio. Alexandra Lang is an architecture critic and the author of 4 previous books, including The Design of Childhood. Her writing has also appeared in publications such as The New Yorker, The Atlantic, New York Magazine, The New York Times, and T Magazine. And she has been a featured writer at Design Observer, an opinion columnist at Dezeen, and the architecture critic for Curbed. She holds a Ph.D. in 20th century architecture history from the Institute of Fine Arts at NYU and has taught design criticism there and at the School of Visual Arts. She lives in Brooklyn. And now, the Virtual Memories conversation with Alexandra Lang.
How long had you wanted to write this book?
Well, this book and my previous book really were born out of my freelance work. And so I think I wrote my first piece about malls in 2018, which was inspired by reading the news about Renzo Piano, the Italian architect, designing this mall out in the Bay Area called City Center Bishop Ranch. And there was a lot of marveling in the press that, someone as august as Renzo Piano would design a mall. Yeah. But I already knew a little bit about the history of malls and Victor Gruen and that other famous architects have designed malls. So my immediate reaction was wait a minute, this is not actually that weird. And let me look into the actual kind of design elements of what he's doing and give people some context to understand that this is actually just the latest iteration of this kind of long design interest in malls.
And of course, tell me about your history with malls. Because I'm 2 years older than you, lived my entire life in northern New Jersey, so I'm pretty sure we're going to have a lot of overlap.
Yeah.
as far as this goes. But yeah.
So I spent the first 8 years of my life in Cambridge, Massachusetts, in the 1970s, and whenever anyone came to visit us from out of town, we would take them to Faneuil Hall Marketplace, which had opened in 1976 and was one of the first festival marketplaces, which were kind of what cities did in the 1970s to try to lure people back from the malls. So from my early childhood, I had this great example of a kind of alternative mall. And then we packed up and moved to North Carolina. And that's where I encountered like the malls that you can find anywhere, like the malls that would be similar, you know, from Durham to northern New Jersey. And as a, you know, tween and teen, I spent a lot of time in those malls, shopping, hanging out, going to the movies. And that was really formative and so different from my experience growing up in Cambridge, which, you know, is a kind of small, walkable city.
And from the, well, I'd say at least from the 2018 period when you started working on the book, but even, you know, as you were learning more about them all over the years, what really changed your understanding of malls and what they mean?
Well, I think one of the most interesting things for me was to understand that malls have periods like any historical form of architecture, that malls have actually changed a lot from their origins in the 1950s to the present. I feel like we tend to think of the mall as this kind of fixed object. But in fact, there had been a lot of theories and changes and like different styles like within the history of the mall. And I think each of those changes spoke to kind of some of the human needs of that period. So being able to look at how the mall like hasn't been the same actually was really revealing in terms of how it might change to meet the present moment.
Yeah, it's one of the most fascinating aspects of the book, that sense of both progress and proliferation, the different models that were tried, the different places they can and can't succeed, what especially becomes a disaster when it's attempted in an urban setting, with some of the majority of the malls that we talked about. I'm also ecstatic that you began with the American Dream and ended with Hudson Yards because...
Yeah, well, those are really like the most current malls, at least if you live in the tri-state area, like the most up-to-date mall moments.
And it's a weird thing. Again, as somebody who's lived in northern New Jersey for most of my 51 years and spent most of that time in malls, I've had zero interest in even going to American Dream. Like I've passed it on the highway and thought, well, that's a place. No, and yes, the pandemic overlaps with that, but you know, it's just one of those things. I'm like, there's no bookstore, there's no comic store, there's no arcade. You know, there are other things there, I'm sure, but
yeah, you know. I don't even know if it's really a place. Like, I think it's more of an object. And, you know, as I describe in the book, it's incredibly depressing from the outside, like even on the scale of malls that often don't invest a lot of money on their exteriors, because that was proven early on to not make much difference to people. But like even in that wider context of malls basically being like a box with big lettering on the side, American Dream is particularly kind of dismal and non-speaking.
Yeah, I appreciated it more when it had the incredibly garish color scheme on the outside, which of course you could see from space or, you know, incoming flights to Newark. But yeah, my GPS sent me past it on Patterson Plank Road recently, and I just looked over. I'm like, I have no interest in going in there or finding out what's inside outside of this ridiculous ski mountain they installed in there.
Yeah.
But yeah, can you talk a little about the, well, I mean, it's almost jumping to the end, but the way we see these attempts at short-circuiting what a mall is to try to create places like this, you know, to sort of circumvent expectations to the point at which we realize those expectations were in place for a reason, that, you know, malls had to mean what they meant.
Yeah, well, I think both American Dream and Hudson Yards suffers from some of the same problems. And like one of those is just gigantism. Like these malls become so big and so confusing that you can't find your way through them. And so you never kind of feel at rest when you're in them. You always feel like there's something you're missing. And the other problem is that they're really pitched towards this kind of national and international audience and not pitched towards their immediate community. One of the things I write about vis-a-vis Hudson Yards is that while they do have this actually kind of great food area underneath the Mercado Little Spain, in the body of the mall itself, it's very hard to find the food. Like your kind of natural instinct, if you grew up in a mall place, is you kind of know where the food court is in the mall, and you can't find it in Hudson Yards, and you honestly can't find it in American Dream either. So your innate sense of mall geography is thrown off. And if you live in the neighborhood, you want to be able to sometimes just like run in and get a bubble tea is the example I use, but run in and get an orange Julius, or just like be able to get from point to point easily. And both of those malls are just like so big and so confusingly organized that you can't do that. And it just makes it really hard to build a relationship to it. And I think one of the things I really do emphasis in the book is how we have built a relationship to these places that, are indeed capitalist, are indeed trying to extract our money from us. And yet, a lot of people have grown to love them and have like very deep personal memories entwined with them all.
Yeah. I mean, I don't know what people who didn't grow up with this sort of thing around them have as far as touchstones. And I know it's a weird thing. And you even bring that up later on in the book with that notion of kids today, younger people having nostalgia for malls that they've never seen, places they've never been to, where we have that sense. I know my first job was a Walden Books in Wayne Hills Mall, which has now been converted into a giant supermarket, which still has a Burlington coat factory attached to it, which is its own thing. But anyway, it's that sense that these places were almost the chronicle of our lives, which is kind of weird. And then seeing them decay as we get older probably says something terrible. But you should probably talk about that before I get too depressing.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's important that for so many people, the mall is like their first step towards independence, either as a tween or a teenager. So it's this time when you're very vulnerable and you're starting to create your adult self. And then that happens at the mall. So it creates this very deep connection to that space, that kind of like mind-body connection. And the mall, in the best case scenario, has all of the elements that you can use to put yourself together. It's like picking records out at the record store. Like, is this cool or is that cool? The same goes for clothing. I was a very nerdy kid, so the Walden Books was really important to me. And I, snuck some books that maybe my parents wouldn't have wanted me to read, reading them in the back.
You're going to say Flowers in the Attic, aren't you?
I'm not a Flowers in the Attic person. For me, it was the Sweet Valley High series.
That's right. Yeah, you mentioned.
Yeah, I know. My parents were professors, and honestly, they could be a bit snobby about popular literature. So that's not the kind of thing I would have really felt comfortable bringing home. But, people were reading it. I was curious. When you're in middle school, you want to read about high school students. So all of those things can happen in the mall in this relatively safe and convenient setting. So I think when teens today have nostalgia for that thing they don't have, it's because it's too difficult for them to find those places, or they've found them online, but they do understand that being there in person would be better.
That is an ongoing question I've had for years now, and I don't have kids, so I don't have an ability to, gauge this stuff, but where do kids go? We had Tower Records, we had these places, you got exposed to culture, you got exposed to different things, but you were physically somewhere.
Yeah.
And I have no idea where kids go. I asked Moby when we recorded a couple of years ago, he's like, I think they're all in their basement. I'm not sure. It's like, I don't really know. I don't see kids in the world nowadays. So.
Yeah. Well, and I think that's a problem too. I think, it's very important for people of different generations to be in a space together. And the mall actually provided that space. And it's really hard to figure out where those spaces might be. I live in Brooklyn and I have 2 kids, and I see them getting together in parks, they'll go and get pizza or bubble tea and then eat it kind of on the bench outside. But those aren't comfortable spaces in the same way that that a mall space is, just because malls tend to have, more seating, air conditioning, lighting, just a sense of sprawl that's often not possible in cities.
Yeah. It's, I wonder, it's an issue you bring up throughout the book, the role of the mall in sort of suborning the common place or the common area for communities, especially suburban ones. And, seeing how that played out long term and, what it meant in terms of private corporations owning, what we considered public space, and then seeing what it means when we no longer go anywhere or have radically curtailed, our exposure to even that sort of public space. I have no idea where the world's going, in other words. So I'm glad I'm on this side of 50 as opposed to the younger side.
Yeah, I mean, when I was working on this book, it was mostly during the pandemic. And I guess I was kind of hoping we would be on the other side of the pandemic when it ended and would have a better sense of how people are going to come back together. I mean, I feel like there is really a desire for communal space, but people are still rightfully wary of it. And it's just hard to know as things drag on, who we all are going to be when we come out of this.
Yeah. What's the first mall you went back to when it was safe-ish?
I guess it was American Dream.
From at the beginning of the book?
Yeah, that trip at the beginning of the book, because I hadn't been going to malls, during the pandemic. And a friend of mine who's also a writer was thinking of doing something about the American Dream and said, why don't we go together? And I was like, yeah, I've been wanting to go because it opened right before things shut down, but I've been putting it off because I wanted to see it in its best light. But
then you discover it.
Yeah, it's like its best light still hasn't happened. And they've recently, they're about to be in default on some loans, so its best light may never happen, which, it's been a long, depressing saga, and the saga goes on.
As a North Jersey guy who stays in touch with, aspects of real estate, and my belief is that most of the world can be explained by real estate scams, but in particular, seeing all the machinations over 20 years trying to build this place and all the potential defaults that were coming in each sale, et cetera. It's just one of the massive ironies of the world that when they finally got it all together and got the thing opened, the world shut down around them. But yeah, I'm full of bad irony like that. But when we talk about where kids go, et cetera, do your kids get malls? Do they understand, what it meant, or is this just mom's weird fixation for her new book?
It's kind of mom's weird fixation. I mean, they might feel like that about whatever I wrote about, but one of my personal ironies is that both of my parents were born in New York City, and my husband was born in New York City, and my kids were born in New York City. So they're part of the 5% of the population that isn't really familiar with malls. None of them really get it at all because they didn't grow up in a place where you need the mall. So my immediate family doesn't get it very much. And my kids, feel fairly satisfied with their life in the city so far, which I appreciate because they have more independence than they would if I did have to drive them to the mall in my minivan.
Yes, or live in the woods like I do in northern New Jersey and wonder, as my mother used to do, just ring a bell at the top of the gigantic hill and woods behind the house and hope my brother and I would eventually come up. It was a very strange childhood. I'll just put it that way. But we live just on the edge, 25 miles from New York, but far enough that it was a wilderness-ish.
Yeah.
But it's funny. You mentioned the Renzo Piano phenomenon at the beginning, and also your parents' snobbishness towards pop culture reading when you were young. How do you think snobbery / elitism has sort of impaired our understanding of malls and what they could really mean?
Well, I think there are two forms of snobbery that have been applied to malls. One is, I guess, a kind of left snobbery towards commerce, that, commercial spaces are always going to be lesser than intellectual spaces or art spaces like museums. And then the other one is the more kind of generalized misogynist snobbery towards spaces for women and children. And my previous book was called The Design of Childhood, and it was about the design of toys and spaces and cities around children and families. And so like that was a very obvious theme in that book, kind of, why is the work of architects for children taken less seriously than the work that they do for adults? But, as I came to find it, malls actually suffer from a similar misogyny because they were generally designed and developed by men for women and children to have a place to go while the men folk were like working at their jobs downtown. Like that was the original, purpose of the mall. And so I think that they were always seen as kind of this sideways space, like sideways to the main event. And that meant that they weren't historicized, weren't analyzed, and weren't written about in the same way as other forms of architecture. I mean, there's actually been more interesting work about them, but again, like in more recent years, in the form of kind of retail and economic history. And I think you need to see malls as kind of continuing on from like department store studies, essentially. Like, what are these kind of pillars, architectural pillars of our communities that happen to also be retailers?
Yeah. Yeah. And again, you have that great section in the book where the real estate trusts start taking over and the IPOs and the corporatization of it all. And it becomes things that did have that local, I'd say where the owners of those department stores felt a sense of loyalty to their community, that this was something they built for the community as opposed to, maximizing profits from quarter to quarter. And, just if it works in one mall, it'll work in 500 malls. Let's just roll it out there. Yeah, you cover a lot of things about the mall that reflect back on ourselves as far as where America has gone, post-war to now. But so congratulations as far as that goes. I was impressed at the number of threads. Although I wondered, were there, I don't want to say rabbit holes, but threads you really wish you could have pursued further in the course of writing this one?
Well, one thing that comes up a lot when I talk about the book to people is a lot of people I know, and I guess you are one of those people, worked in malls. And I think there's probably maybe a different kind of book to be written about employment at the malls, like people's memories of working at the mall and kind of the backstage spaces and
I worked in the management office of a mall too.
Yeah,
so back in grad school, I was in the Annapolis Mall when Nordstrom was coming in, and this was the big negotiation and how are we going to handle this whole thing? And I was just some 23-year-old kid, but there's so much behind it in addition to working in retail, but working behind that. There's plenty
and
there.
also, I mean, the maintenance of the mall, the security of the mall. There's actually quite a good documentary called Jasper Mall about a dying mall in, I can't remember which southern state, but the hero of the documentary is the manager of a mall that has very few stores left. And you really do see him interact with all of the store owners, him talking to the community and, people kind of already missing the mall, even though it hasn't closed yet. So I think a broader kind of sociological look at working at the mall would be great, but I just felt like it would be really hard for me to do that, given all the other themes I wanted to pursue and also in the context of the pandemic.
Yeah, I was going to say that's the toughest part. You would have had to really be out there interviewing people.
Yeah.
And that's.
And also, sort of, you mentioned the whole REIT, IPO, takeover of the mall. Ultimately, I'm an architecture and culture reporter. And so there are business stories as well as sociological stories that I would love other people to do, but I'm maybe not the best person to do them.
Yeah, tell me about your background and your we'll say training. How did you become the writer you became?
Let's see. Well, when I came out of college, I worked for New York Magazine for about 5 years. But I had been an architecture major in college, and I was always sort of planning to go back to architecture school. But while working at New York Magazine, I got really interested in writing architecture criticism rather than being an architect per se. So I went back to school and got a PhD in architecture history. And after I got that degree, I really tried to turn all of my writing towards the topics of architecture and design and criticism. And so, yeah, that's basically my background, this kind of like dual track of journalism and architecture history, but always trying to use that history to talk about the present day.
Cool. And did you have the Ada Louise Huxtables or other idols as far as...
Yes, Ada Louise Huxtable is my idol. And I don't know, some people read right over this, but the epigraph to my book is from Ada Louise Huxtable from a piece she wrote about malls in the mid-1970s. And she had a very, very dim view of malls. So I felt like one of the things I had to do with this book was kind of cast off the shadow of my mentors and say, okay, like if you were born when she was and you had the training that she had, you saw malls this way. But if you were born when I was and you have the training I have, like you see malls in this totally different way. And maybe, she just didn't have the kind of generational position to understand them.
Yeah. And that's certainly, there are critiques to it. I mean, you cite a couple of people. You have Frank Lloyd Wright show up at one point with, just
yeah,
condemning
you have to
him.
put that in, right? Like him being a horrendous snob.
Yeah. And it's expected. But, there is that sense that, once you get past that shock of this isn't how we did things, isn't what you build for, you discover a lot of people like this building and, a lot of people like what it's there for. And it becomes something over generations like this. But yeah, it's a question I had with Witold Rybczynski, who I've recorded with a couple of times over the years. I don't want to say the use of architectural criticism, but the focus on reviewing a building or critiquing a building when it opens. Mm. And his take was that's useless. You sort of need to see what it becomes and how it's used over time. That, an immediate impression of a building isn't as useful as, what it comes to mean as it's used. We understand the media need to produce something new, but at the same time, that sense that a building is something that needs to be lived in and worked in.
Yeah. No, I totally agree with that. I don't always agree with Witold on his, takes on buildings, but I totally agree that looking at buildings over time, like how people adapt them and what they actually like and appreciate about them is really important. And for me, it's also, I think sometimes if you only focus on, let's say, elite buildings, it's very hard for architecture criticism to find a broader audience. Like, it's really important to me to write for a broad audience. I am very interested in popular culture, and I think that architecture should be part of the popular culture discussion. So, that's how you get to malls.
So if I ask if you have a guilty pleasure building, it's really just malls in general? Or is there one in specific that you're like, yeah, I can't justify it, but I really just love the way this building looks, works, and functions?
Well, I actually try not to use the term guilty pleasure. Like,
I know.
I think that's part of the problem.
So, I'm a fan of the movie Hudson Hawk. Trust me. I have things that I'm like, I can't justify this, but this is something I love. Right. So there.
But I think some people could perceive me as making a whole book about guilty pleasures. Is there one mall that I really like that I feel I shouldn't? Gosh, not really. Like, I have a pretty postmodern appreciation of architecture in general. Robert Venturi described the postmodern position as both and. So I can love something like John Jurdy's Horton Plaza, which was basically like a carnivalesque version of an Italian hill town, built in San Diego in the early 1980s. So I can love that. And I can also love North Park in Dallas, which I also talk about in the book, which is this really very beautiful, minimalist, white brick version of a mall that you could imagine being a museum. So I love both of those things. And I guess if you love both of those things, there's no guilty pleasure.
Everything's in between.
The whole span. That's it.
Mall that you have not visited that you really want to see?
Okay, well, this is a little embarrassing, but I haven't actually been to the Mall of America.
I was just about to ask. I figured that was going to be the one that, I've been to Minnesota.
Yes. Yeah. I mean, I've been to Minnesota, but I had a whole family trip to the Mall of America planned for April 2020. We were going to go
Oops.
there for my kids' spring break and stay in the hotel that's attached to the mall and play blacklight mini golf and just like spend 2 days at the mall. And that was going to be kind of the centerpiece of my chapter on John Jurdy and turning the mall into an entertainment center. And then that got canceled. And I, had to regroup in a number of ways. And I realized that I could write about what John Jurdy did in a different way and write about the Mall of America, like more in context and less as a kind of standalone phenomenon. And I think that worked out fine. But yeah, a lot of people tell me about the Mall of America. And I'm always a little bit embarrassed that I haven't been there. But that is a mall that definitely looms large in people's minds, and a lot of people have childhood memories about trips there.
When we talk about mall sense, which I consider like spider sense, but much less useful, is there something you would always hone in on, either young or as an adult? Like you got into a mall, this is how you orient yourself, or this is the thing you naturally, zoom over towards first?
Well, yeah, I think a person should naturally orient themselves to the fountain. I mean, kind of find the centerpiece of it's the title of the book. And that, my editor actually came up with that title, but he came up with the title after reading the book, like the fountains, to use metaphor, bubbled up to him as something that people, both I and other people that I was quoting kept coming back to. So I think you find the center of the mall and then you fan out from there. And I think the problem that a lot of people have with the geography of the mall is that they try to think about it in the context of the outside. And really the outside is not important. You should ignore the outside. You have to get into the center and work your way out from there.
Which sounds like a good metaphor for much of life, frankly. But, I'm good with that too. Do you dream of malls that don't exist?
No, not really. I don't really.
So I'm putting myself out there then.
What's in your dream mall?
Oh, it's not that, it's Pantheon Dream Mall, but I have had dreams where I'm walking through places that I know don't exist. But because malls are the background of my life, it's malls, comic stores, and bookshops. And I would just encounter these in dreams and I'd wake up like, that doesn't exist, but it was an awfully nice comic store or bookstore or just mall in general to meander through. Yeah, it's clearly living in North Jersey too long has gotten to me.
Well, the mood of that really reminds me of the mood that I get put in when I listen to Mall Wave, which is this music that is propagated on YouTube where people remix songs often from the 80s to make them sound like they're playing in the mall, to have that kind of atmospheric, tinny, like low-res recorded sound. And I think that that music really puts you in that headspace of exploring this place you've never been, but that has all of these elements that are strangely familiar.
Yeah. I mean, this ties back to that question about where kids go. It's that same moment you have in the book where you're citing Mall Wave, and it's in relation to how the mall was somewhere. And this is why I mentioned Tower Records before, where you would hear music you didn't know about. You would encounter new stuff because you weren't streaming everything and you weren't, deciding it all, and you didn't have headphones on. And, it's that weird sense of community that in my isolation and seclusion, feel like everybody else is isolated and secluded from, that we're sort of missing that sense of randomness.
Yes.
This is getting off of the subject of your book.
No, but I totally agree. And I think that, that's one of the things that malls perform. It's the randomness of other people, but it's also the randomness of encountering music, fashion, books, whatever that you wouldn't have encountered on your own. It's the same difference as reading the newspaper on your app or leafing through a physical copy of the newspaper. I know I read a lot more stories of the sports and business sections when I have the physical paper than I ever would if I was just trying to flip through the headlines on my phone.
Right. Yeah. And get things curated as to what you should be reading next, as opposed to, just stumbling across something. Yeah. Yeah, it's a weird trip. I'm getting on a plane tomorrow for the first time in 2.5 years, so I'm expecting a whole Gil discovers that the world has changed drastically moment then and there. So I may report back after this, but we'll see how that goes. But do you believe the sort of the die-off of malls is going to be as severe as predicted?
I do think it's going to be as severe as predicted, but I feel like what many of the stories about the mall die-off don't really emphasize is even if the various analyst predictions come true, there'll still be 700 to 800 malls, which is a lot, right?
Yeah.
So even as the malls are dying, there are still a very large number of them that are succeeding and will still be with us. So like, while I spend a lot of time talking about like what might be done with the malls, because I really want that to be a place where people put energy and creativity, I also think that saying that the mall no longer serves a purpose or people no longer need or want the mall is incorrect.
Yeah, talk a little about that and that closing area of the book where you sort of talk about some of the repurposings and ways that malls can be transformed to still be relevant in terms of what they are.
Well, one of the reasons that malls had to be was because the suburbs basically split themselves into, highways and residential areas. And, there were a few churches and schools, but there was no space for people to come together. And that was partially the result of single-use zoning. Here's a residential area, here's an industrial area, and never the twain shall meet. And I think one of the most important things that's going to need to be done to bring dead malls back into circulation and make them actually, kind of help their towns is to get rid of that single-use commercial zoning that's true for most mall properties and say, okay, like we have all of this parking lot, we have the empty architecture of the mall itself. Could this be the nexus of a new neighborhood? Like, could this be a school and new housing? Could this be a church and a medical office and new housing? Like, could this be a combination of things that has never been built here before, but is closer to an old-fashioned village or an old-fashioned downtown?
Yeah, it's when you see, well, again, when you've lived in the same place for so long as I have, you see the transformations certain places have undergone, and it's, well, there's no baseline to compare it to, I guess, in terms of, where we're headed into the future with these things and how they get used. But seeing these attempts at changing them or trying to become relevant or adding community aspects that once upon a time were just devoted to as much retail as you could get, it's, I guess, I don't want to say optimistic, but it's a good sign. I'll take it that way. So, but what do we miss about what the malls reflect back on us? We talked about suburbanism, in some respects, child rearing, car culture, capitalism as we know it. What else do the malls tell us about ourselves that we're not necessarily paying attention to? There's race. I forgot race, which is the biggest thing that you cited at the very beginning, that a racist model is what creates the mall.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, just to go into that, I mean, as part of the suburban development of the U.S. In the post-war era, those suburban developments were designed to separate white people from the messier, more mixed environments of the city. And many of those suburbs were either implicitly or explicitly only housing opportunities for white people. So then when you build a mall surrounded by neighborhoods that only white people that can buy houses in, the mall serves only white people. And over the decades since, the demographics of the suburbs have changed, as well as many of our laws. And so the demographics of malls are also changing, but sometimes those two things aren't happening at the same time. And that leads to conflict. One of the things I talk a lot about is how, malls have been a space of freedom for teenagers, but Black and brown teenagers are often heavily policed in malls. And so they aren't really the same space of freedom for teenagers from those backgrounds as they are for white teenagers. And that's often actually reflected in media. Like you see in a movie like Mean Girls, you know, the mean girls shopping at the mall, but then in a variety of TV shows, including like The Fresh Prince, and Everyone Hates Chris, you see the main characters and side characters kind of picked up for shoplifting by mall cops, you know, erroneously. And that's the Black teen experience that is shown on TV.
Yeah, so I thought it was interesting near the end of the book, the way you kind of flip the use of malls into these, we'll say that ethno-burb model where you start bringing in malls that are specifically diverse, the way, you know, they find new purposes in terms of either Latinx or Asian cultures coming in and just, you know, let's make a place that we really like to shop and has all the things we want to get here. So,
yeah, I think that is it's a really popular model. It's a really positive model. I think it's something that may save malls in a lot of places where part of the reason the mall failed is that it's now very out of sync in its offerings with the people that actually live around it. And again, this is a place where community ownership or like kind of small commerce ownership like might serve the mall a lot better than a vast national conglomerate that doesn't really know how to tweak the mall to that particular location.
Your favorite mall stores?
My favorite mall stores?
Chain you would bring back if you could restore a chain that you used to go to in the 80s or 90s?
Well, okay. I really loved the Gap in the 80s. Like you can pay tribute to that. Yes. I'm a fairly classic dresser, and I just think there need to be more places where you can buy like 100% cotton and 100% wool clothes in bright primary colors in all the sizes. And I shop at a lot of places now that I feel like are basically trying to sell me versions of what I bought at the Gap as a teenager, because the Gap is certainly not selling it. The Gap is selling all sorts of like weird, slimy, fast fashion-y clothes. So yeah, I look at pictures of the Gap from those years, just the branding, and I can remember the texture of the plastic bags that they gave me my purchases in. So yes, I have a very deep and abiding love for the Gap of the 1980s.
Nice. Yeah, I'm torn myself. I didn't shop enough, or at least I wore terrible clothes. So there's no, big fixation. It was more the bookstores, like I said, than anything else. But also the other story I forgot, I once flooded a mall also. That's, the Granite Run Mall down in Pennsylvania. I used to work at a men's clothing place there and was, back in high school. And, I came in one day and they wanted me to dust the sprinklers. That was my assignment. And of course, the sprinklers exploded, flooded the store and flooded all the stores underneath and drained out into the parking lot. And it was February, so that all froze. And that was it was another great mall experience. Now that I think about it, these things really are the touchstones of our lives.
I can imagine that being a scene in some sitcom, and then you have to like learn an important life lesson from that.
Yeah, or just a side bit in Fast Times at Ridgemont High. Certainly, that's I will say the other thing when you bring in the pop culture thing, I'm the only guy who was a teenager in America in the 1980s who never saw The Breakfast Club. Yeah. And to some people that doesn't seem that weird, but I know it's like being in The Americans. Like that's going to be the thing that's a giveaway that I'm actually a spy, that someone's going to make a Breakfast Club reference and I don't get it.
Yeah.
But that doesn't make sense. Gil's 51 years old and he lived in America. That'll be the big clue. But do you have I would say a sort of evolution idea of malls, or do you see the proliferation of malls as and the different designs, the different ways that they're going as sort of a I don't want to say natural selection, but ways of finding optimal uses nowadays? And do you think there's a model we're not thinking of, or that you would really love to see implemented as far as where malls can kind of reinvent or repurpose?
Yeah, well, I mean, as an urban dweller, like I'm definitely kind of in favor of diversity and adaptation, which I think a lot of kind of commercial districts and cities like do well. So yeah, I see more different types of malls as being a good thing, and really kind of going back to malls more being in more direct dialogue with their surroundings, both physically in terms of not having the parking lots be moats, having public transit access, like having trees in the parking lots and bike routes, all of that kind of like physical connections, improving the physical connections, but also then, improving the connections between what businesses are in the mall and what the people around them like really want, what would really serve their needs and make them want to, come back again and again. So I see that as really positive. Yeah. And I think one of the kind of visionary ideas that I find really appealing when I look at some of the studios that architects have done on reinventing the mall. The number one thing is cutting roads like back through the mall. Like a lot of these malls are part of neighborhoods that have a much smaller street grid, but then you get to the mall and it's just kind of this blob of space, which makes it very hard to cross unless you're driving in, parking, and then walking across the lot. So thinking about all the ways that you can put routes back through those spaces, and how those might open up connections to the surrounding neighborhoods, how that it might improve the kind of walkability and bikeability of those suburbs. Like all of that's very exciting. I have a section on mall walkers that was that excerpt was published at City Lab, and a story that somebody told me that made me really sad was that her parents were mall walkers. They had a particular mall, I think in New Jersey, that they would go to, a few times a week to walk. And when it was closed for the pandemic, they just went to the parking lot of the mall to walk, because that still felt like a safer, like better paved space than any of the parks or sidewalks in their community. So just think about how much better that outdoor space could be if communities, owners, et cetera, like wanted to put the money and design work into it.
Yeah. Yeah, it's a really fascinating book. Again, one that I've got an inherent interest in because it's burned into my genes, this understanding of malls. But yeah, I just thought it was fascinating seeing that phenomenon as you bring up that sense and that tension you create throughout of the mall as community space, but also as privately owned property with its own codes and regs in terms of who can be there and when.
There's always an ambivalence to it. I would say that, you get what you pay for, but can we also ask more of the entities that are regulating the space that we've paid for? And can we also kind of like get more for the wider community from those privatized spaces?
Yeah. I will say the major one near me is Garden State Plaza, which started out outdoors and closed, began digging underneath, and has been expanding and expanding. We'll say metastasizing, however you want to phrase it, but just growing immensely. But one of the weird things about it was the department store legacy, which is still tied into so many of these places, because there was a stretch where it had really expanded and it formed this sort of Q shape from how it built. But the thing at the center of the Q was a JCPenney. Mm-hmm. With all of these high-end places nearby, Neiman Marcus, Nordstrom, all these other things built, added over the years, they were still stuck right at the center with this, we'll just say lower rent department store. And when that went under, it's been closed down since. I joke that they should just make a giant laser tag or, some other crazy function inside there, or just battle royale, let kids go nuts. But
That is
But yeah,
very reasonable. That is actually a very reasonable redevelopment idea. I mean, trampoline parks and things like that have been like successful examples of reuse ideas for department stores. And especially in a place like New Jersey, like lots of families need places to go on the weekend for birthday parties, all of that. You know, I've done a trampoline park birthday party in Queens, and it probably would have been a lot more convenient if we lived in the suburbs.
anything you miss in terms of suburbs versus city outside of, again, access to malls?
Well, sometimes it would be nice to have a bigger yard. I mean, I'm a big believer in public playgrounds. I think kids want to play with each other. Like every kid does not need his own climbing structure. But sometimes you just want to like sit in your yard with a cup of coffee and, look at the grass. And yeah, when I visit my friends in Westchester, I appreciate their yards.
That sounds like something I should be doing in about 20 minutes or so for my mid-morning coffee. But I guess as a last question, and it ties back into the Hudson Yards thing and a trend that comes up in the book a few times. Do malls work in an urban setting? Or is that stacked model just not what a city functions on? Because it comes up, but you never deal with it like explicitly. Yeah. You show how some of them decline.
Yeah.
But yeah.
They can work. Like if you have been to any major Asian city, like you see that they can work. But I think that the malls in the US maybe haven't learned enough from those Asian models. Like they're not, the vertical malls that we build like aren't connected enough to public transportation, don't have enough real like destination stores in them, don't have really, kind of fabulous food options. And so they end up being separate from people's, kind of day-to-day routes through the center city. And a lot of those urban malls are very dismal from the street. And I think that is always a mistake, to kind of build it as a fortress within downtown when the reason that people are downtown is, to be on the streets, to see other people, to kind of connect.
Yeah, it's something I've puzzled over. Is when Time Warner Center went up, mm-hmm. I went in and thought, wow, you brought a little bit of Short Hills Mall right here to the middle of the greatest city in the world. It just, right. it doesn't seem like there's a need for that sort of thing.
But Short Hills Mall is better. I mean, Short Hills Mall is one of those malls that has been successful from like its very origins to the present day. Like
it was always rich people's mall when I was a kid.
Yeah.
That was that's where the rich people go. We don't go to that mall, but we'll stop once every few years, but yeah. And I'll pass it on the way to the airport tomorrow morning. But yeah, it's that sense of trying to drag these things into the city when the city's meant for something, a different type of shopping or a different type of experience mm-hmm. overall. That's always kind of perplexed me. But like I say, I see the world as a series of real estate scams. So, it would make sense as to why you try this stuff anyway. But real last question, who you been reading?
Who have I been reading?
And I should have warned you that was coming. People always hate drawing a blank on this one, but I'm hoping you'll rally.
Well, I have to say that I've recently been writing an article about the history of lofts, like Soho lofts, loft living. Mm-hmm. So I've been rereading that section in New York 1960. And also reading Sharon Zukin's book on loft living that has a lot of, it's very funny to read these sociology books from like 10, 15 years ago and see how, kind of like ironic quotations from the New York Times from like the early loft dwellers just like seem even more ironic now. Like as, those apartments are worth, $5 million, $10 million. So I just like, it's always fun to kind of dive back into like the last round of literature on an urban phenomenon. I mean, that's definitely something that I did for the mall book. So most recently I've been doing it around lofts.
Interesting. And I won't ask if this is the next book because authors hate being asked about what the next book is.
That's not the next book. That's just an article. I'm not somebody that can come up with the next book until the current book is like completely finished, and talking about the book on podcast like means it's not finished yet.
It's okay. I'll let you work through the process. But Alexandra, thanks so much for coming on. I love the book, and maybe it'll get me to go back out to a mall. I've been kind of avoiding that since, this whole situation started, but you kind of make me pine for Garden State or even Paramus Park at this point.
Well, I would definitely encourage you to do so. So thanks for having me on the show.
Thanks.
And that was Alexandra Lang. Her wonderful new book is Meet Me at the Fountain, an inside history of the mall, from Bloomsbury, USA. I, as you can tell, loved it, so I hope you give it a read. Alexandra is on Twitter and Instagram under the same handle, Lang Alexandra, which is LangeAlexandra. Her website, which has much more of her writing, interviews, and other great stuff, is alexandralang.net. I'll have links to that in the show and episode notes for this one. Now, you can support the Virtual Memories show by telling other people about it. Just let them know there's this podcast comes out every week, neat conversations with fascinating, creative people. You can also help the show out by telling me what you like and don't like about it, who you'd like to hear me record with, what movie or TV show or book or music or comic or piece of theater or art exhibition or whatever you think I should turn listeners on to. You can do that by sending me a postcard, letter, email, or by leaving me leaving a message on my Google Voice number, which is 973-869-9659. That goes directly to voicemail, so you don't have to worry about me picking up and getting stuck in a weird conversation. But messages can only be up to 3 minutes long. So if you're going to go super long, call back, leave another one. And also let me know if it would be okay if I included your message in an upcoming episode of the show. I wouldn't do that without your permission, but if you've got something you want to share with the audience, just let me know and we'll include it. Now, if you've got money or other resources to spare, I hope you'll support individuals and institutions in need. I'm doing just fine. My day job treats me well, sends me on trips like this, keeps me relatively well paid, and the expenses for the podcast are pretty minimal, all things considered. So if you've got money, give to other people. Go through GoFundMe, Patreon, Kickstarter, Topatogo, or one of the other crowdfunding models, and see if you can find people who you can either support healthcare needs, artistic projects, whatever it is. If you're looking for somewhere to start with institutions or foundations, you could look to your local food bank, the Poor People's Campaign, Freedom Funds, election funds, Planned Parenthood, other causes and other ways of trying to help make a better world. So that's what we're here for.
Our music for this episode is Fella by Hal Mayforth, used with permission from the artist. You should visit my archives to check out my episode with Hal from the summer of 2018 and learn more about his art and painting. And you can listen to his music at soundcloud.com/Mayforth. And that's MAY4TH. And that's it for this week's episode of the Virtual Memories Show. Thanks so much for listening. We'll be back next week with another great conversation. You can subscribe to the Virtual Memories Show and download past episodes at the iTunes Store. You can also find all our episodes and get on our email list at either of our websites, vmspod.com or chimeraobscura.com/VM. You can also follow the Virtual Memories Show on Twitter and Instagram at vmspod, at virtualmemoriespodcast.tumblr.com, and on YouTube, Spotify, and TuneIn.com by searching for Virtual Memories Show. And if you like this podcast, please tell your pals, talk it up on social media, and go to iTunes, look up the Virtual Memories Show, and leave a rating and maybe a review for us. It all goes to helping us build a bigger audience. You've been listening to the Virtual Memories Show. I'm your host, Gil Roth. Keep reading, keep making art, and keep the conversation going.